calls for new gun control in the wake of the Sacramento shooting, plus a conversation with Radley Balko on the killing of Amir Locke. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head on over and check out our membership options today if you want to get exclusive access to firearms journalism and analysis that you cannot find anywhere else on this planet. You would also get access to this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment, which we actually have another one this week. We got a good streak of member segments going, which I always enjoy because I like to learn a little bit more about the kind of people who are signing up for the Reload and creating this new little community we've got going. But this week we have Radley Balko, who is a investigative reporter and columnist at the Washington Post. He's joining us. Welcome, Radley. Thank you so much for coming on. Can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself in your own words?
Sure. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. I'm an investigative reporter, both for the Post and other publications. I've written 2 books, Rise of the Warrior Cop, which came out in 2013, and then we updated last year, and then The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, which is kind of about death investigations and a forensic scandal in Mississippi that went on for about 20 years. I am a libertarian, support gun rights, maybe not to the extent that a lot of other gun rights supporters may, but I do generally believe in the Second Amendment and the right to defend yourself, right to gun ownership. I used to work at the Cato Institute and Reason, and now I'm at the Washington Post.
You obviously focus quite a lot on the criminal justice system, policing,
right?
And there's clearly a number of ways that those issues intersect with gun rights in America. And we actually have a very recent case that we just had some news on this week, in fact, out of Minneapolis with Amir Locke's shooting. The police officer involved in that case is not going to be charged. Can you just give us just a little summation of what happened there and why this officer isn't going to be charged?
So as I understand it, the police were looking for a suspect in a shooting. They obtained warrants to several residences of people who had some sort of connection to the suspect. Amir Locke was not the suspect.
Right.
I believe the suspect was his cousin. He was staying at his apartment, and the police conducted a no-knock raid on the apartment, a legally a no-knock raid. They claimed they knocked and announced as they were coming in, but for the purposes of sort of anybody inside, it's really no different than a no-knock raid. And Locke apparently reached for, according to the body camera footage, reached for a gun as the police came in and they shot and killed him. Again, he was not the suspect, was not suspected of any criminal activity whatsoever. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer wasn't charged because, and he probably, he shouldn't have been, because the officer saw what he thought to be a suspect reaching for a gun. And usually what happens in these types of cases is the officers are excused because of, the volatility of the situation, because it's a highly sort of dynamic environment with very little room for error. The problem, of course, is that the police created those dynamics. And, if Amir Locke had shot and killed one of those officers, odds are pretty good that he would, odds are pretty good he'd probably be dead. And if he had survived, he would probably be charged with some sort of crime. And so even though the police create the dynamic situation, the volatility in these raids, and even though the police sort of had the advantage of knowing that it's what's going to happen, and the police had the advantage of being armed and wearing ballistics gear, and even though the tactics themselves are designed to sort of disorient and confuse people, when the police make the mistake in these raids, which clearly seems to be what happened here, they're generally given the benefit of the doubt and let off. The people on the receiving end of these raids, I got my start in journalism based on a case by a guy named Corey May, who was raided and shot and killed a police officer, and ended up serving 10 years in prison, including about 6 years on death row. so the people aren't given the same benefit of the doubt during these raids. And so my argument for a long time to the gun rights community, again, which I consider myself a member of, is that if you know really value gun rights, we need to be speaking out against these types of tactics, and that they should only be used in situations where somebody's life is in imminent risk. To use these tactics for evidence gathering, for investigation, you know, in a country where I don't know what percentage of homes now own guns, you know, there's going to be a lot of mistakes. There are going to be a lot of raids based on dirty information. And so a lot of innocent people are going to get caught up in all of this and are going to be killed or are going to kill police officers and face criminal consequences for that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the Amir Locke situation is obviously the most recent one that's garnered a lot of attention, probably in large part because there was body cam footage of what happened. And
Right.
so people can more objectively see exactly how that went down and give the idea that Amir Locke perhaps didn't realize what was happening when the police raided the home, and it seemed like he didn't wake up immediately. And then this series of events led to his death. And so the critique here is, I guess, from what you're saying, not necessarily that the police officer himself, who was the individual who actually fired the gun, was doing anything that was illegal or even necessarily unreasonable. I mean, he had reason to fear for his life given the gun involved, but
Right.
the problem is the tactic and the setup and the way that it unfairly disadvantages regular Americans' rights. Is that, that correct?
Look, yeah, you break into somebody's house while they're asleep, you know, early in the morning or late at night, and you elicit a very primal reaction in people, right? As the fight or flight response kicks in. And if you're in your own home, flight isn't really an option. And so most people are going to, you know, if they have any kind of protection, you know, if they're armed in any way, they're going to reach for that those arms to protect themselves. And, you know, I've seen this, I mean, I've been covering this issue for about 20 years and I've seen it over. I mean, the pile of bodies just keeps growing. People who've been killed in these situations. It just happens over and over and over and over again. And, you know, the interesting thing about it is, or kind of the outrageous part of this, I guess, is that, you know, nobody ever really considers these tactics from a kind of from the perspective of the people who might be inside these houses who are innocent, right? When Joseph McNamara, who was a police chief in San Jose and I believe Kansas City for a long time, but was a political conservative, worked for the Hoover Institute after he retired at Stanford. You know, he talks about a conference once he held in Los Angeles about the use of SWAT tactics and no-knock raids to serve drug warrants. And one of the things I interviewed him for my first book, and he's passed away now, but he talked about this conference where he had, I can't remember everybody involved. He had like a district attorney, a police chief, another high-ranking police officer, a judge, and he a city council member maybe. And he asked all of them, you know, who should make the decision on when police use these kinds of forced entry tactics. And what he found was that nobody who had the power to kind of restrict these tactics or to consider them from the perspective of anyone other than the SWAT team themselves was willing to say, this is when we should use them and this is when we shouldn't. And so it basically came down to the head of the SWAT team got to decide whether or not the SWAT team was going to be used. And, you know, if you are the head of a unit like that, you want to be used as often as possible, right? You want to be seen as useful. You want to be, you know, productive. You want to be seen as a vital part of the police department. Now that has changed in some departments, including Los Angeles. There's a threat matrix that some of the larger city police departments go through when they decide what types of tactics to use. But that's really only in a handful of large cities, and in most parts of the country, and a lot of these small towns and counties, sheriffs that have their own SWAT teams. You know, the decision is really kind of more ad hoc. And, you know, we've seen from surveys done by the ACLU, by Peter Kraska, a criminologist at Eastern Kentucky, that, you know, somewhere between 75 and 80% of these types of forced entry tactics are done to serve warrants for drug crimes. And so, you know, you've gone from using these types of tactics, this forced entry, that at one point were reserved for situations where someone was in the process of committing a violent crime. So you think, domestic violence situation, hostage taking, an active shooter, a bank robber. That's how this was primarily used until about the early to mid 80s, these types of tactics. Now they're primarily used to serve a warrant on someone who is still merely suspected of a nonviolent consensual crime, right? You're not, the person hasn't even, we're not even sure the person committed the crime yet. We're still investigating because that's the whole purpose of the search warrant. And so you're using these overwhelmingly violent tactics that are designed to sort of to confuse and disorient people, where there's very little margin for error. And you're using them to investigate often sort of low-level drug crimes that are still in the investigative stage. And it's a massive shift in how governments have used that kind of force over the course basically of my lifetime. And there was never any sort of discussion or debate about whether, the cost benefit of using that kind of tactics, never mind kind of the more sort of profound civil liberties implications. And so that's the conversation I think that we've had really since Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that on a kind of a national level we hadn't had until that point, as this shift was taking place.
Yeah, and I think there's an extra layer of conversation to be had in regards to the gun rights implications here as well, because a no-knock raid, as most people understand that term, is one where you have no warning that someone is breaking into your house or for what reason, or you have no warning that they're with the police department. And even in that situation, of course, somebody just yelling that they're with the police department is as they break down your door.
Which happens frequently. I mean, there was just a video and story about that just about 2 days ago that I retweeted. That does happen fairly often.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, I believe David French has talked about this when we had him on the podcast previously, but it kind of erodes your gun rights as well, because generally speaking, the castle doctrine, which we have in most states, would say that if someone is breaking into your home, you have a right to defend yourself with your firearm. But these no-knock raids create situations where, that's not necessarily true, right? I mean, even in I believe there was a case a while back, and perhaps you can recall the name of the person involved in this, but I think the police raided the wrong home, and the person inside was armed and shot at the police, and then was charged for that. I've written about many cases like that. I would say, I don't know, couldn't estimate over the years. I would say at least a dozen, probably a couple dozen. But Corey May, the case I mentioned that I kind of got my journalism career started with, was one of those cases. This was a guy who was at home alone with his 18-month-old daughter. The police conducted a drug raid at 12:30 in the morning. He lived at a duplex, and on the other side of the duplex, there was a known sort of drug dealer, but Corey had no affiliation with him. But the police raided both sides, whether it was a mistake or they were just trying to be thorough, or who knows. And Corey, wakes up and this bedroom door flies open where his daughter's asleep on the couch or on the bed, and he's on the floor, holding a gun, and he shoots and kills the first officer in the door, and then realizes they're police and immediately surrenders with bullets still left in the gun. And, in those cases, the person almost always gets charged and prosecuted, usually convicted. And, you have to kind of think about, put yourself in that person's shoes. So let's assume the worst. Let's say a guy like Corey May knew that they were cops, and for whatever reason, I think he had like a burnt roach in his apartment, right? He was a recreational pot smoker, but it would have gotten him a $50 fine under the other circumstances. So, you could say that this guy was worried about that $50 fine, and so he decided to knowingly take on a heavily armed team of police officers, shoot and kill just one of them, and then surrender with bullets still left in the gun. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think the more, intuitive thing is that he didn't know they were the police. And as soon as he realized that they were, he surrendered. And that's, I think, I've talked to I interviewed a lot of police officers for the book, and a lot of the older generation of police officers said, told me that, including the former police chief in Washington, D.C. in the 70s, when the no-knock raid became the Nixon administration had made it sort of a national policy. But they said, people in the drug trade, even when you have the right place
and you have a known drug dealer. Nobody goes in the drug trade to kill cops, right? They know that if you kill a cop, you're going to be lucky to survive the next few seconds, and if you do, you're probably going to go to prison for a long time, and you may probably go to death row if you're in a death penalty state. So even when a drug dealer shoots back at the police, it's usually because they think that they're being raided by another drug dealer. Because there's no reason for them to take on a heavily armed group of police, because that's not going to end well for them. But the problem is the drug war is fought with dirty information. It's fought with information from confidential sources. It's sometimes rumors, anonymous tips, and that's what these raids are being conducted upon. And so they often don't get the wrong, they do get the wrong house. We've seen in Chicago, there've been just stream of stories for the last 4 or 5 years about Chicago PD narcotics units raiding the wrong house. The most recent case, the city just settled for several $1 million with this woman who was naked and was pulled out of her shower and handcuffed naked while the police searched her home, and they had the wrong house. They're just, I can't even begin to tell you. I used to document on my blog, a few of these cases every week. I can't even tell you how many times it's happened. Fortunately, not all of them end in tragedy with someone dying, but, it's a lot of trauma. It's to have the police break into your home and throw you on the floor and put a gun at your head over, what's usually some sort of drug crime is it's a very traumatic experience. And I think it is antithetical to a philosophy that believes that you have a right to self-defense, a right to have armed guns in your home to defend your home, because the police can do this sort of with impunity. And if they even, they often get the wrong address because they're doing it on bad information, and you're caught in one of those situations, and you do what any person who wants to defend their home would do in any other circumstance, that could get you killed. That could get you arrested. That could get you in prison. And so if you have this right, but you're not allowed to exercise it because the police are engaging in this reckless policy that puts you at risk if you exercise that right, then I would argue that you really don't have that right.
Right, and so that's obviously the civilian side argument, or the civil rights side argument for why these tactics are inappropriate or on balance overused, I guess is the right term here. But
right.
Certainly from the law enforcement side of things, you could make the inverse argument here, right? There's, as you alluded to earlier, there's 46% of Americans now report having a gun in the home. And so you'll hear people talk about how that just that level of an armed populace creates a higher risk for law enforcement. They never know who might have a gun, who they're trying to arrest. You're going into someone's home or going in to arrest a suspect in a criminal, especially a violent crime, is dangerous,
Sure.
right? And so these tactics are often justified as keeping officers safe. But in your writings, especially the piece you wrote for the Post about Amir Locke, which people can go and read as well, you argue that it's not proven, and that even if it was, the way it's used now wouldn't be justified. Is that right?
Well, so, I don't think anybody would argue that the police should not be allowed to force their way into a home if somebody's life is in imminent danger. If you've got somebody who's threatening to kill someone, somebody who's taking hostages, you have an active shooter situation, right? But the law is always allowed for that. Anytime the police have this type of emergency exigent circumstance, they're allowed to go into a private residence. The whole reason why you need a no-knock warrant is because there isn't anyone's life in danger, right? It's sort of premeditated. They're saying we need to get in before this person can, flush their drug supply, or we need to get it, because if the person presented an imminent risk to someone else's life, the police could go in immediately. The reason why they get these warrants is because they want to preserve evidence. They want to get in there quickly, and they want to preserve their arrest, right? It's not even necessarily about, they're worried about these drugs getting on the street, because if that was the case, by the time they're flushed, they're all, you're right, that supply is off the street. They want to get in, and they want to be sure that they have enough evidence to make an arrest. And, so I would argue that well, let me back up a little bit. There are a couple more points I think that are worth making. One is, when the police actually believe that somebody is dangerous and a threat to law enforcement, they often don't go in sort of guns blazing in the middle of the night. They get more creative. Um, One example I give in my book is Whitey Ford, right? Or Whitey Ford, I'm sorry, Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mobster, who had a couple dozen possible alleged homicides to his name. Was getting old. If ever there was somebody who's going to go down in sort of a blaze of glory, it would be Whitey Bulger. And so when they found him, what did they do? Well, they didn't conduct a no-knock raid on his house in the middle of the night. What they did is they did some research, and they discovered that he had a storage locker in his apartment complex. And so they called and said someone had broken into a storage locker and they needed to come down and sign some papers. And so they came down and signed some papers and they arrested him. And that's the police tend to get creative when they're dealing with actually dangerous people because it's safer for them that way.
Mm-hmm.
When you have somebody, you don't want to force a confrontation with somebody who's going, has a good chance of shooting back. One of the more telling things that came out of the Breonna Taylor case was that there was a master's student in criminology who was embedded with the Louisville Police Department for, I think it was like 6 months or so. And he wrote a paper based on this. And so he was on a lot of these raids. And what he said was he observed that on a lot of these raids, which were supposed to be knock and announce raids, or the police are supposed to give the people time to come to the door and let them in peacefully, the police basically announced themselves as the battering ram is hitting the door, right? So they thought that they were technically complying with the knock and announce requirement. They weren't. They weren't under the law, and they weren't under any sort of practical, reasonable, rational interpretation of the knock and announce rule. Those were illegal no-knock raids that they were conducting. But when really, and that's happened. I mean, we found this all over the country that police just sort of announce as the battering ram hits the door. But the really interesting thing that this student found when he was embedded with them is that when they were facing an actual dangerous suspect as opposed to a drug suspect, when they're trying to arrest somebody for who was a suspect for murder, the head of the SWAT team would say, "We really need to make sure we knock and announce this time." And the reason why is because when they were afraid that somebody was actually going to shoot back, they wanted to make sure that they knew that they were the police, that they were, because those people, they didn't want to have the kind of, the mistaken identity that can happen during these raids. And I think that's pretty telling that when they have an actual dangerous person, they want them to know that they're the police. Whereas when it's sort of a low-level drug offender, they kind of go in, kicking doors down and do what they can to kind of take them off guard.
That's interesting.
So,
I
think
so you don't really buy the idea at all that this is in the interest of officer safety, these sort of raids. You think that it's more evidence collection, and
I don't think it protects the officers. I think it puts the officers at more risk because, again, you are eliciting a very primitive response in people when you break down their door and you wake them up in the middle of the night with armed men pointing guns at them. It takes a while to register what's going on when you wake up from a deep sleep, right? And no matter how many times they yell police, if you're woken up in the middle of the night to armed men coming in and pointing their guns at your family, even if they say they're the police, even if they're wearing a badge, like, how do you know that? You don't know that's true, but it also is going to take you a few seconds to sort of realize that and for that to register mentally. And you're going to have all sorts of adrenaline pumping. You're going to be a little bit groggy. So yeah, I mean, I've argued for a long time that I think these tactics actually make things more dangerous for police, particularly when it's this kind of premeditated no-knock raid. I will say when you have an active shooter situation, of course, by all means, the police need to get in as quickly as possible and try to control the situation. But when you're dealing with even a suspect in a violent crime, I think, you can wait until they're coming or going, unless you're afraid they're going to commit a crime imminently. You can wait till they're coming or going, or you can do what they call surround and call out, which is where they bring a large battalion of officers. They get on a megaphone and they tell the person they're surrounded and they give them a chance to come out peacefully. I've talked to police narcotics commanders who sort of generally kind of agree with me on other things. And they say, well, the reason why we can't do surround and call out for drug warrants is that we just have too many of them. It takes too long to do a surround and call out. When you have 15 or 20 or 30 drug warrants you're serving a week, it's a lot quicker to just kick doors down than to do this big kind of show of surround and call. And I think that's telling. It's not about constitutional rights or what's safest. It's about what's easiest.
Yeah, I was thinking a similar thing when you were describing the Whitey Bulger takedown. Obviously, that was there's a lot of planning goes into something like that.
Right.
But that's an interesting point. But so you make a delineation between obviously a raid where there's some sort of imminent situation, a hostage situation, or domestic violence or something of that sort, and these pre-dawn no-knock raids that are planned in advance. Then there's nothing actively happening inside of the residence, right? That seems to be like the thing you do distinguish. You're not against police kicking down doors and going in certain circumstances
to save lives.
Yeah, it's
right.
It's just this particular tactic of these pre-dawn raids that, and I mean, I think if you watch the Amir Locke badge cam video, what you're describing, I mean, it holds up in that video. I mean, he seems to not be awake immediately as they break down the door, but when they kick the couch, then he seems to wake up and not know what's happening, and has a gun, right. And so gets shot.
And people, I've read, on Twitter and various other people, you see people, sort of law enforcement, pro law enforcement people being like, well, they announced themselves several times, he should have known. Well, whether or not he should have known, let's talk about, let's look at it rationally. If you put yourself in his position, I mean, this is a guy who had no criminal record, right? He was not suspected of this particular crime. He just happened to be staying with a cousin who was suspected. Why in the world would that guy knowingly decide to take on a team of police officers and try to kill them as they're coming in, right? Again, the far more sort of rational interpretation of what we see in that video is that this guy was terrified and he didn't know what was happening and he reached for a gun because he was scared and he was trying to defend himself. I mean, that is the really, I think, the only interpretation that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, honestly, I agree with that take on the body cam footage in that case. Now, one of the policy solutions here is eliminating these no-knock raids, which Minneapolis mayor has just announced he's doing. I believe Tuesday this week, he actually made that policy change permanent. Is that the proper solution in your mind, or what do you want to see happen?
So again, I don't think there's any reason to get a no-knock warrant ahead of time. There's just no scenario under which that makes a lot of sense to me. If the police believe somebody's life is an imminent risk, they can already go in without having to get a warrant ahead of time. If there's enough time to get a warrant, then nobody's an imminent risk, right? You're getting the warrant because you need to preserve evidence. Now, maybe there are some limited scenarios. Maybe you have, somebody who you think is going, maybe there's evidence of a murder that would help implicate somebody, that you're worried is going to be destroyed or moved. Maybe there are some limited circumstances. I do think it's great that we're seeing jurisdictions across the country now ban no-knock warrants and no-knock raids. Again, even the bans on no-knock raids are not banning the kind of imminent danger situations, right? They're banning them in the sense of these kind of premeditated no-knock raids. But again, a right without a remedy isn't really a right? So if you ban these no-knock raids, but if the police do them anyway, there are no consequences to that, then, it doesn't really matter that you ban them, right? Because they're going to continue to do them. So Virginia actually has, I think, one of the better no-knock raid policies in the country, which is that they ban no-knock raids except in very limited circumstances. They ban nighttime raids except in very limited circumstances. But then there's also an enforcement mechanism. The police have to knock, announce, and give the person inside the opportunity to come to the door and open it and let the police in peacefully. But then also the police have to be wearing body cameras and they have to record themselves conducting these raids. And one thing I found over the years in a lot of these cases is the police will, either lie or they will just badly misremember what actually happened. And so without that footage, the police can just say we knocked and announced, and it's the word to get the person inside against the police officers. I wrote about a case in Myrtle Beach where the police shot this guy over a dozen times. He actually survived, but he lost several organs and he's paralyzed. And this is over two $50 pot sales. And the police, this is one of these multi-jurisdictional task forces, and the police, every member of the task force said over and over again, we knocked and announced ourselves multiple times, waited, a long time, gave him lots of opportunities to answer. Then we finally battered down the door, and he fired at us, and that's when we opened fire. Well, we later learned that the gun the guy had never been fired. So then the police said, well, he just pointed it at us after we knocked and announced several times. And again, every single member of the task force said they knocked and announced multiple times. Well, the guy had surveillance camera, and when the police didn't realize that. And so when the video came out, and I've written a lot about this case, it's very clear from the video that there was no time for them to have knocked and announced several times, as they all claimed. And then we find out in depositions that they didn't even really have a policy on knocking and announcing. There was no formal policy. They weren't even aware of what the law is under Supreme Court precedent on the knock and announce rule. And so that video, without that video, it would have been the police word against this guy who they, portrayed as a drug dealer, and he would have been completely out of luck. Instead, he got a multi-million-dollar settlement. But nobody on the task force was disciplined either for the raid itself or for lying about it or misremembering it, I guess, afterward. But I guess my point here is that when you have one of these policies that has to be enforced, there has to be an enforcement mechanism to it. And if I could give you one more quick little spiel about why I think this is important. So the Supreme Court in Wilson versus Arkansas, this case from the 1990s, they recognize that the knock and announce rule is part of the castle doctrine, which you mentioned, this idea that the home should be a place of peace and sanctuary, and that this doctrine goes back to English common law. It goes back to the, 14th or 15th century. And the government can only violate the castle doctrine under very extreme circumstances. Otherwise, you have to be given the opportunity to let the police in peacefully and avoid the destruction of your property and violence to your person. So the Supreme Court recognized this in this Wilson case, but they also recognized these exigent circumstances that allow the police to get around that rule, right? Well, so what happens is after Wilson versus Arkansas comes down, police departments sort of compensate by saying, well, all right, one of the exigent circumstances is that the person is either violent or if they might dispose of evidence before we can get in if we knock and announce. And so they started saying, well, all drug dealers, anybody suspected of drug crimes is either violent or a threat to dispose of evidence. So they just started cutting and pasting that language into every single search warrant, and they just got a no-knock raid for every single drug warrant. Well, the Supreme Court comes back and says, no, you can't do that. You have to give specific individualized evidence as to why this particular suspect poses an exigent circumstance, right? And if you don't do that, then the no-knock rate is illegal. Unfortunately, then in 2006, the Supreme Court says, okay, well, we're not overruling Wilson versus Arkansas. We're still saying that the knock and announce requirement is still law, but we're going to eliminate the exclusionary rule if police violate it. So basically, they took away the primary enforcement mechanism for the knock and announce rule, which is that if the police find contraband in your house, they can't use it against you if they violate the knock and announce rule. And so the court basically said the court recognized this right, but then took away the best way to enforce it. And so what's happened since Hudson versus Michigan in 2006, where they took out the exclusionary rule, is the police have violated the knock and announce rule with impunity because there's no penalty for them for violating it. There's no incentive for them to honor knock and announce. And so you get situations like Louisville where they say police as the battering ram hits the door. You get situations like in Myrtle Beach where they admitted under oath that they routinely violate the knock and announce requirement because there is no punishment when they do so. And so there's a huge advantage, at least police think they have a huge advantage to taking people by surprise and not announcing themselves. And because the Supreme Court has said, we're not really going to enforce this right, or we're going to take away the means of enforcing it, the right just doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think through these things, I think, for a lot of gun owners, because traditionally, gun owners the culture has been very pro law enforcement. And there are these tensions between making law enforcement as easy as possible and keeping your rights intact. That's obviously something that's always been in tension, and it's fascinating to watch. You could look at a group like the National Rifle Association, right? And they're very strongly supportive of law enforcement, of course, and they have a lot of law enforcement programs. They're hesitant to critique law enforcement in these situations, frankly. I don't believe they've said anything about Amir Locke to my memory, although people can correct me if I'm wrong on that point. They never said anything officially about Philando Castile either. It seems there is quite a lot of support for law enforcement, of course. I mean, my grandfather was a police officer for his entire career. And, you have this affinity towards law enforcement. It's certainly in certain segments of the gun rights movement. You certainly have other segments that are more prioritize civil rights protections over the goodwill of police officers, I guess. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase this,
right.
But how do you see that tension between an inherent respect for law enforcement and the concern over the violation of gun rights? And how do you reconcile those two things? How do you, right. I mean, maybe you can't completely, right? And this is probably true for all civil rights, trying to balance against the interest of law enforcement. But I mean, how do you get to that point?
Well, if you go back to the 1990s, the gun rights community wasn't so sort of reflexively pro law enforcement, right? I mean, you had when the ATF was conducting raids on gun owners, you had the NRA and other groups were vocally speaking out against aggressive law enforcement tactics, exactly like the kinds that we're talking about.
Jackbooted thugs comment.
That
was a
thugs,
huge
right?
political problem for them, right? Wasn't it?
And you had G. Gordon Liddy on his talk show advising gun owners to shoot for the head, right? when the police raid your house. And I'm not advocating
right.
that.
I mean, you still have some of that rhetoric in certain quarters, of course, about police infringements. And it's not, I don't want to say that there's no one strongly pushing back against these things. It's just there's clearly in our gun culture a priority put on respect for law enforcement in the mainstream gun rights movement in large part.
Well, and I think and I think that's I think the NRA has actually been on the wrong side of gun rights a lot. I mean, the NRA opposed the Heller case all the way up until it got to the Supreme Court, right? They did not want that case. That Heller was brought by a group of sort of libertarian gun rights activists in Washington, D.C. I think the NRA has become more of a culture war organization than a gun rights organization. And one example I always bring up is Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick was a gun owner before all of this started happening, before the whole take a knee thing. And, I think it was a huge missed opportunity for gun rights groups to find common ground with, the Black community, particularly Black athletes. A lot of Black athletes are gun owners. But a lot of Black athletes also, endure or have experienced racism at the hands of law enforcement. And I think there was, the NRA decided for whatever reason to make Colin Kaepernick sort of a public enemy. Even though he had never said anything disparaging about gun owners or gun rights, and probably, I imagine, supports gun rights, given that he owned a gun. There's, he had video on his Instagram of him at the shooting range. And so I think, the NRA decided, probably because, as you mentioned, they have a huge law enforcement contingent among its membership, that they were going to sort of take a side in this issue that really had nothing to do with gun rights. And if anything, I think, civil rights and gun rights are one and the same. I mean, I don't think you can necessarily separate them, particularly if you look at, the history of gun control in this country and the way it's been sort of imposed on the Black community. I think that law enforcement, I would agree that police officers have a difficult job. I agree that their job is probably made more difficult by the fact that, almost half of U.S. households do own a gun. But I also think that, as a staunch libertarian, I don't think that our rights are contingent on how convenient it is of the government to abide by them or to respect them, right? That our rights exist no matter how difficult it is for the government to enforce and respect those rights. And so we can't just say we're going to dispense with the Fourth Amendment and the Castle Doctrine because it's just too difficult to have both that and the Second Amendment, right. And it just makes it too difficult for law enforcement. Yeah. I understand the tension there, but I don't think we give up our rights because it's inconvenient.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a lot to this that we're not going to be able to cover in one podcast. But obviously, there's the NRA is at butts heads with law enforcement in certain circumstances, right? And more, for instance, constitutional carry or permitless carry, you have a lot of police groups that are opposed to that for basically the same reasons. It makes it harder for police to arrest people they suspect of being criminals because it takes away a charge of carrying without a permit, even if they don't have evidence of any other crime. And so, certainly the NRA is not completely, beholden to law enforcement's interest. And there is obviously a very big split within law enforcement itself, generally between like big city law enforcement groups and more rural, like sheriff's groups. You see that too. There's a huge cultural difference, and their views on
and rank
guns
and file
are
officers
hugely divergent as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to get into, and the NRA is not the only gun rights group that is very supportive of law enforcement, and you have other groups like the Firearms Policy Coalition, for instance, which has taken a more aggressive civil libertarian approach to the law enforcement. So there's a myriad of different issues at play that we can't get into completely, because one other thing I wanted to ask you about quickly here is some of the other area that you focus on besides law enforcement and policing is also criminal justice. And we've actually seen just recently sort of the collapse of using ballistics matching in court. At least the scientific backing of that has been drawn into serious question. You wrote about this at the Daily Beast earlier this year. Can you talk a little bit about that issue as well?
Right. Yeah. So for a long time, the FBI has claimed, and then other ballistics experts, particularly those trained by the FBI, have claimed that they can take a bullet found at a crime scene and match it to a specific gun based on the markings on the bullet that are left by the barrel of the gun. And for years, decades really, they've claimed to be able to match a specific bullet to a specific gun and claim on the witness stand that this gun and only this gun could have fired this bullet because of these marks, which can often be microscopic. And it's always been suspect, because anytime you're going to make a claim like that, you have to know the frequency with which those marks are going to occur in the entire population of all bullets fired by all guns, right? So if you look at DNA, for example, which is a forensic technology that actually came from science and wasn't developed in a police setting or a law enforcement setting. With DNA, when it comes to DNA markers, we know how frequently each DNA marker occurs in the entire human population. And so when a DNA expert testifies on the stand, you'll rarely hear a DNA expert say, this blood could only have come from this person. What they'll say is, this blood contains these markers. This person has these markers. Here's how often those markers occur in the human population. Therefore, the odds of the blood coming from anyone but this person are 1 in 6.2 billion, right? Well, you can't do that with ballistics, because we don't know how many guns could have possibly created these marks on this particular bullet. There's just no way to know that. You can't. And there are people who are actually trying to put databases together to get a better estimate on this, but they're finding it very difficult. What you might be able to do is you might be able to say, there's no way that this gun could have fired this bullet. You can exclude a gun as the source of the marks on a particular bullet, but to say that these marks could only be caused by this gun to the exclusion of all other guns on the planet, there's just no scientific evidence for that. And the scientific research that has been done has said that that's just not a conclusion you can make. And so what's happened is
it's interesting, because it's it feels very much out of CSI, right? That's a very common trope on that show. Which is a very popular show. But it always seemed like kind of a stretch if you think about it, because one, the bullets are mass produced, right? The guns are mass produced in almost every situation. Now there may be, like you said, you can eliminate based on caliber, based on perhaps the way the barrel twists in some cases. If you have a strange gun that has a twist that goes left instead of right, or the traditional rifling methods, there's some things where, like you said, you could eliminate certain guns, or you could at least narrow it down to this model of gun. But matching perfectly the bullet, and especially considering what a bullet does, what happens to a bullet after it's fired.
Right. After it leaves the
Right.
gun.
I mean, it always seemed like a pretty big stretch. Like you could exactly match this bullet to that exact one of 10 million, Glock 19s that have been produced. So it's interesting to see that one, that it's been so widely accepted. This is something you write about a lot. It's sort of pseudoscience that's commonly used in criminal cases. Is even when it's not really commonly used in civil cases because it's not reliable, you'll still see it used in criminal cases. And this is something that obviously has directly to do with firearms, which is what we talk about. And I think it's fascinating. And now you're seeing a big pushback to it, right?
Well, so there's been a pushback in the scientific community and with, sort of the criminal justice reform community. Ballistics matching is part of this field of forensics called pattern matching, and it's includes bite marks, it includes shoe prints, tire tread, and it all involves basically there's no kind of computer that like you see on CSI that sort of matches things up perfectly. Right. You get that with fingerprinting, although partial prints are still problematic, but most of the time it's an expert looking at two things, sometimes under a microscope, and just sort of eyeballing it and deciding whether or not it's a match or not. And, that in itself is problematic. How much information they were given about the broader crime. You can have cognitive bias creep into how they're doing the matching. There have been proficiency tests given to ballistic experts about where we know the answer and they don't, it's often no better than a coin flip, the results of those proficiency
tests. But these are still used today, right? A lot of this evidence is still being used even with this pushback.
So that's what this article was about, was that, a few judges here and there are now starting to push back a little bit. And it's the most sort of faint and sort of lukewarm of pushback. Basically, they're telling these experts, you can say that this gun could have fired this bullet. You can say, I can't exclude this gun. All they're saying is you can't say that this gun and only this gun, to the exclusion of all other guns on the planet, is the only gun that could have fired this bullet. And it's driving the ballistics people crazy that they're not allowed to say that. And so what I wrote about was this memo that we got from the director or the attorney, the counsel for the crime lab of the FBI, who was basically advising ballistics experts on how to get around judges who are trying to limit their testimony in that very sort of narrow way. But even that is they're taking offense to the idea that they should be limited at all in what they can tell judges.
Right. Well, people should absolutely go and check that piece out over at the Daily Beast and your other piece at the Post. And also, if they're interested in your book, which you said was just reissued last year, just updated, where can they find that?
Anywhere. Rise of the Warrior Cop is what it's called. We added a few 3 chapters, and I rewrote the introduction and the conclusion to sort of take the narrative up through basically January of 2020. So it's pretty updated now. And any place you get books, it should be there. Hopefully.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we really appreciate you making the time to come on and talk to us and give us your perspective. I think it's really fascinating. So hopefully we could have you on again in the future too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Wonderful. Appreciate it.
All right. It's time for the weekly news update. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing good, Jake. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Got a big story. Everyone's talking about it in the news, at least as of recording this, that big shooting out in Sacramento. A certain senator from California made headlines with her response to that shooting. And you wrote a piece about it, Steve, if you want to tell us about it.
Yeah. So Dianne Feinstein, who's the Democratic, she's the senior senator from California, in response to this shooting in Sacramento, where 6 people were killed and 12 more were injured, she immediately called for, as has become sort of common now, new gun control legislation at the federal level. Of course, she called for universal background checks, an assault weapons ban, a ghost gun ban, and magazine limitations. But of course, the problem with that, or the issue at hand there, is that California already has all of those policies in place inside the state. And obviously they didn't stop this shooting from happening. She put out this statement, of course, before also that there were any details about what had happened, really. There were no suspects apprehended at the point. There have been now 3 people arrested in connection to the shooting. 2 of them are convicted felons. One who was actually sentenced to 10 years in jail in 2018, but I guess was released early against the wishes of the DA's office in his local part of California. But obviously, felon in possession charges against two of the suspects, and also a machine gun charge, possession of a legal machine gun against one of the suspects. So they had already broken several federal gun laws, in addition to obviously a myriad of local laws against murdering people, to put it bluntly. And so, this is something that we talk about a lot in gun politics, is this debate over how to stop mass shootings, and especially when they happen in places that have strict gun laws already. Commonly, you'll see gun control activists advocate for those same gun laws, but federalized. Their claim is that they're being basically California is being disserved by their neighbors, or at least by states elsewhere in the country. And so that's effectively what Feinstein was arguing here.
Yep. You saw it wasn't just limited to her. The president came out and made a statement that was similar, basically reiterating the same policies that he said for the last, several public appearances where he's touched on guns. He just, lays out liability for gun makers, background checks, assault weapons ban, the usual. So in a way, it was sort of a messaging discipline among Democratic politicians afterwards, because they all just said the same thing in response to the shooting before we knew details. And as you pointed out, there were already several federal laws that were violated for this shooting. So it wouldn't have really made a difference anyway.
It's always interesting because obviously a lot of Republicans will get criticism for, the refrain of offering thoughts and prayers. That's become is sort of a default position for a lot of pro-gun politicians in the wake of mass shootings. But now the default position from gun control advocates in the wake of these shootings is to just list off their policy priorities that they want instituted regardless of what has happened in the shooting. I mean, obviously this shooting, there's no evidence at all that anyone involved bought a gun across state lines and then took it into California. And of course, there's also the issue of like Nevada and Oregon, they have universal background check laws as well. So the direct neighbors, unless these guys were from, went to Arizona, which I mean is possible, but nobody has actually presented any evidence of that being the case. And they wouldn't be legally allowed to buy guns in Arizona anyway, because they were prohibited under federal law. This is where like a lot of these things fall apart under inspection. This has become the default response to a mass shooting, and it doesn't matter where it takes place or what the details were. The response is we need to pass these, our top priorities if you're a gun control advocate, and that's the answer. Even though in this case, from what we know, these were, I believe, also there's a report that the guns were, at least one of the guns was stolen. Which is another illegal. I mean, these guys committed probably a dozen different crimes before they even started shooting at people, both federal and state crimes, right? So it's a little bit hard to believe that passing more federal gun laws would have had an effect on this particular shooting. And, everyone's been calling this a mass shooting as well. And, that's another conversation we can get into real briefly here, which is like, it's not entirely clear this is a mass shooting in the sense that most people would understand that term, because what happened in this situation was there was a fight outside of a nightclub at 2 a.m. That apparently escalated into gunfire. It sounds more like a shootout. And now it happened in a crowded area, and it sounds like there were quite a lot of innocent victims, which is horrendous. But this is different from, your Sandy Hook or Parkland type shooting. But it's being labeled in the same way and bunched together, which has become a common thing in media as well. And especially since most major media outlets changed the definition of mass shooting years ago. I mean, if you look at Mother Jones, which has, I think, the fairest definition of what most people would understand a mass shooting as, which is like a public killing that where 4 or more people are killed, is essentially the FBI definition of mass murder, but committed with a firearm, and one that doesn't involve things like drug disputes or gang wars or those types of crimes, which are obviously still horrendous and tragic, but different from what most Americans understand a mass shooting to be, because the random nature of a mass shooting, the random public nature of it is sort of unique in the American psyche, I think. And you get a lot of people misled by the way these get labeled, because that, now they get, the argument is that one of these happens every day, but I think most people, and I think that hurts the credibility of a lot of media, because most people understand intuitively that something like Las Vegas does not happen every day in the United States. Right? I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It not only does it hurt the credibility of media for people that are kind of paying attention to that distinction, but also muddies the water for policy discussions and response, because as you said, there's a very different root cause of a dispute on the corner or a dispute outside of a bar that escalates and turns into a quick act of violence versus someone that may or may not be under the radar for most of their life that suddenly just goes to a public place and starts gunning down innocent people. Both are obviously horrible. No one likes to see anyone get shot. But the policy response to both of those situations is going to be very different. And the fact that this new definition where it's just, 4 or more people getting shot in an incident, it sort of obfuscates both of those. And you don't really have a clear policy response to that, because obviously they're very different responses for very different causes.
Yeah. I mean, we had Professor James Allen Fox on the show, a couple months back, who runs the database for the Associated Press on mass shootings. And they used a definition closer to what Mother Jones has. And he said, look, it's obviously tracking 4 or more shot can be a valuable data to have.
Sure.
But it's clearly different. Most of those shootings are very different from what the average American would understand as a mass shooting, and that's where you get into the problem. And like you said, there are also very different solutions to sort of a random individual trying to kill as many people in public as they possibly can, and a fight escalating into deadly violence. Or drug-related killings, which all have different solutions and different causes, and lumping them all together doesn't really accomplish very much, I don't think. And that's where you start to run into a lot of problems, and that's when the only reason, the only benefit from doing it that way is really to just push a broad agenda, because, obviously, if you think that these policies are going to generally help with preventing gun violence, then you're going to want to implement them regardless of the instigating incident, right? And that's sort of the approach you're seeing with gun control advocates and how they respond to this shooting in Sacramento, I think.
No, I think that's right. I do want to give some media, at least some media outlets, a little bit of credit in this incident, because, a lot of times they'll just parrot whatever the politicians say, we need more gun laws, and they won't really air the other side. But I did at least see, I believe it was the Sacramento Bee, at least point out after some of these claims were made that, look, California already had all these laws in place, which I think is worth noting, because a lot of people, particularly on the pro-gun side, can get a little jaded by media outlets and coverage of this stuff. But I do think it's worthwhile to point out, in this case, they at least pointed out that, hey, look, all these policies you're calling for are already the law in the state where this incident happened, which is good reporting, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a necessary thing to do. I mean, I think it's difficult to write about what Feinstein and the president had said without noting that, look, where this happened, they have exactly the policies that you're proposing. So And like I said, obviously the gun control advocates have a counter to that, which is that the looser laws in other states are undermining the strict laws in California. People can make up their own minds about how convincing that argument is. And it sort of, I think, also undermines the idea of having strict gun laws in your state, right? I mean, if they're not, what's the point? If you're saying that they can't stop these shootings because of what the laws are in other states, it's just kind of an odd argument. But certainly there's plenty of people who find it has more credibility and credence than I do. So that's just my personal insight on that particular point. But yeah, so we're going to keep on top of this. I think also it's important to note that none of those policies that the president or Dianne Feinstein have advocated for are going to pass in Congress anytime soon. It's just not going to happen. And depending on how the midterms go, which right now it sure looks like they're kind of go well for the Republican Party at this point, based on polling. Things can change certainly, but these policies aren't going anywhere anytime soon at the federal level. And that's important to note too. I mean, this is just to give the audience some clarity on the actual practicality of implementing the things that Dianne Feinstein had called for. But,
no, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll keep it up. We have actually now another members segment, which is always my favorite segment. And we're going to head on over there now. All right. We've got another members segment this week. I'm here with member Andrew Fagel, who is a PhD in early American history and has studied quite a lot of the early American firearms as well. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about your background for the listeners who don't know you?
Yeah, so I went to graduate school after college to study early American history. And in the process of doing so, this is late 20-aughts, discovered that the field of firearms in early American history was generally understudied. And I ended up writing a dissertation on the growth of the American arms industry between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And from that, I've had a number of publications on that broad topic, mostly for academic audiences.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating, right? I mean, I feel like in academia, guns really are very understudied and treated as something that is synonymous with criminal activity, right? Like you get a lot of study of criminal use of firearms and a lot of writing about that. It was very similar, of course, to how news media treats guns as well. But it's really looking at such a tiny piece of the puzzle that is guns in America, right? Because most guns are normal and normal people use guns, as Professor David Yamani has said, another guest we've had on previously. And there really is not a lot of focus in either news media or academia on the way people actually use guns, the history of guns. I mean, we had another member just recently who wrote a book on John Moses Browning, who was able to obtain primary documents, source material from his family, because there really hadn't been much actual historical inquiry into his life. This was for a book, for publication, but it's just kind of amazing how underserved that all really is in our academic institutions. So it's interesting to speak to someone like you who is actually doing that kind of work. What is some of the more interesting things that you've written about?
Well, so before I get to that, I mean, one of the reasons why I think that that's the case is that about 25 years ago, you probably remember this, there was a book called Arming America by a historian named Michael Baliles. And Baliles' thesis was that firearms in early American history were relatively rare. And it's only with the growth of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century that guns become part of American culture.
Interesting.
Writ large. The problem with that book, it was most historians accepted the argument. And it was really in a couple of different like law journals, National Review, where people started pointing out that, hey, some of the sources don't say what you're saying. And the book ended up being retracted it won the Bancroft Prize. That got retracted. He ended up resigning his position from Emory University over it. And it was a big academic scandal from the early 2000s. And I think part of that kind of, who wants to engage with that kind of argument and with that scholarship of a massive scandal within the last, 25 years that ended a career. And, so one of the things about that book is that he had, whether it was academic malfeasance or oversight, I don't know. But within the book itself, he had a lot of interesting ideas, like Native American gun culture in the 17th century. And it's only recently that scholars have gone back and it's like, yeah, Native Americans developed a very robust firearms culture almost as soon as there's contact with Europeans. And that develops over the course of the next 200 years, things like that. So at least for myself, I write mostly on what we might consider the military industrial complex in early America. I don't really say it that way.
So that's how a layman might understand it, right? Someone like
right, right. So it's things like the Springfield and Harpers Ferry arsenals, DuPont, which we think of as a major chemical corporation now, actually started as a gunpowder firm to make black powder for the federal government, because all the other competitors in the country were using literally mortar and pestle worked by hand to make black powder for these massive contracts. And they decided we're going to mechanize the process, things like that.
That's amazing. That's really incredible. I mean, I think there's a lot of history there that just kind of goes unexplored to a large degree. I mean, I suppose you gave sort of an interesting explanation for why that might be in recent history, but and certainly, obviously, people get sort of pop history is driven by big events like the American Revolution or the big wars. World War II is still extremely popular for history documentaries and so forth. But there's so much interesting stuff in those spaces in that time period, and in how it really affected the development and growth of the United States, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my own particular take on it is, how does the United States go from this country in 1775 that's largely dependent upon foreign sources of arms and munitions to make its revolution actually work, to self-sufficiency and an exporter by the War of 1812 period. And, it ends up being that it's a real political problem that's addressed everywhere from the federal level all the way on down to local level, state and local levels, to try to bolster American arms manufacturing in the country. So yeah, it's a huge story of what governments were actually doing in this time period when we think of the federal government not really doing all that much.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually, it appears that you have one of these firearms from that period behind you. Is that right?
Yeah, that was. I bought this as a present for myself a couple of years ago from. I got it on auction at the Rock Island Armory. It's a model 1798 Eli Whitney musket, probably delivered to the federal government sometime in 1806. If I understand the way the brass band works on this correctly.
Fascinating. And so what I guess that's War of 1812 era.
Yeah, War of 1812 era, early Republic. I mean, with Eli Whitney, if people think of him today, it's cotton gin,
right?
Which is one of the most important inventions in American history, in terms of basically expanding the institution of slavery across the West. But Whitney did not make much money from that because it was a relatively simple design that anyone could just copy and not have to pay the patent rights. He made his money making muskets for the federal government.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's where there's all these little interesting facts throughout American history, and when you're dealing with firearms, I think people just don't know or remember anymore. That sort of reminds me of the ghost gun that I bought a while back from my local store. That was a Sears model semi-automatic shotgun. I don't think most people who are under 40 today would know that was such a thing. You could mail order shotguns from Sears, and obviously going even further back, someone as famous as Eli Whitney, who's world renowned for inventing the cotton gin. Most people would not know that he had an arms company that sold guns to the federal government. So, it's pretty amazing the way that firearms are intertwined with really all sorts of major American institutions and people throughout history.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you've, this reminds me a lot too of when we had Ian McCollum from Forgotten Weapons on, right? He's very into the history of firearms, although it seems like you go perhaps an era further back than he does in a lot of his stuff.
I mean, my one claim to fame is that Ian McCollum based his video on the Chambers machine gun off of an article I wrote on the history of it. So that's like, I wrote something that someone popularized on YouTube, has 500,000 views. Most academics are happy if 10 people read their article.
Right. Can you give us a quick rundown of what the Chambers machine gun is?
So this was what's described as a superimposed load firearm, where the general idea is if you have a barrel, instead of just having one bullet at the back of it firing out, you'd have a number of bullets with black powder charges spaced out. And you'd fire from the front, bullet would leave, and then the next chamber in the round would be ignited. That would go out kind of like a Roman candle.
Yeah.
And people had been experimenting with superimposed loads ever since the early history of firearms. And so what this was, Chambers, he probably worked with this guy named Joseph Belton in Pennsylvania during the American Revolution, where they were trying to introduce this idea of let's outfit people with these superimposed load firearms in the Revolution. That really doesn't get anywhere. Chambers brings this idea up again in the early 1790s, and it's in the War of 1812 that the U.S. Navy actually adopts some of his weapons. One of which, it looks like a Gatling gun. It's like 7 barrels. Each one is loaded with, some, 40 to 50 shots.
Wow.
And the idea was that this thing was going to start firing, and it's going to go for a couple of minutes until it fires all of its bullets. The problem with this, as you might imagine, is that there's a lot that can go wrong in, I think it's 224 shots in one of these things.
Right.
So there's reports at the time of these guns, probably more dangerous to the user than to the person standing in front.
Oh, yeah,
but when they work great.
I bet. I mean, it sounds like what it sounds like to me is when a round gets stuck in the barrel of a gun, you just keep putting more rounds behind it. That sounds like a pipe bomb.
Yeah, exactly. There's one of the reports I have is there's these the British capture a couple of examples from the Navy on the Great Lakes, and someone tries to load and fire it, and there's the newspaper account of his arm getting blown off when he tries to shoot at. So, kind of horrible stuff. But there's also the reports of some of the demonstrations under controlled circumstances, where apparently the French ambassador to the United States, we're going to order these right away. These are amazing. Let's get them to Napoleon. One condition, under no circumstances can you sell it to the Russians. Things like that.
Well, it could use that rule again today, I suppose. But this is another thing about guns is the other aspect of why so many people are interested in firearms is this mechanical aspect, the development history of firearms. It's all very fascinating. Similar reasons why people are into cars or any number of other things, architectures, something along those lines. And it's another area that just doesn't get talked about a lot. And that's why, something like what Ian is doing is so popular.
Right.
But yeah, so how did you come across the Reload? What's your story there for becoming a member?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I think I came across you on social media at one point in time, like right when the site was first being launched. And I think I ended up signing up sometime in the summer of 2021, like right after the hard launch.
Nice.
And at least for why I did it, I mean, most of the reporting on firearms that was out there tended to be from one extreme or the other. And, I think guns are really important for understanding American history. And I think that they're also really important for understanding our own contemporary world that we live in. And so, well, I think it's perfectly fine. And I mean, I have my own biases and that we all do. It's the importance of being dispassionate and trying to present all sides and have conversations with all sorts of people that was, shall we say, sorely missing in a lot of online reporting on firearms and even in print reporting. So, that's the thing that I like the most about the Reload.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what we try to do. I mean, this episode of the podcast, we've got Radley Balko from the Washington Post, who's a unique perspective. He's not necessarily somebody you're going to find on a lot of gun podcasts.
He's great. Yeah, Rise of the Warrior Cop and the County Dentist on the bite mark evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that book is phenomenal.
Yeah, and so I mean, we try to bring in all kinds of different voices. We've had people from gun control groups. We've had people from gun rights groups. We've had all sorts of advocates. I tried mostly to bring on experts who can speak to whatever's, in the news at the time. But I just think it's important to be informed and be fair and serious when you're talking about this subject, because it's something that affects really everyone in the country, even if you're not a gun owner. And, we now have surveys that show 46% of Americans report having a gun in the home. That's the latest number out of the University of Chicago. But, even if you're not one of those people, you're likely affected in some way by firearms, and even just by living in the United States, as you have discussed here on this segment of the show. Like it was an important part of the historical development of this country too. And it's something that rarely gets looked at as in a light this way, like from the perspective that we're trying to do. And that's why I thought it was important to found the Reload. And I'm glad that it's something other people value as well. Yeah. And look, hey, I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk a little bit about your background. It's always fascinating to meet people who are actual Reload members and see the diversity of what's out there in our little community that we've started to build here. It's been almost a year. I'm hoping we can grow and expand from here. Things have gone pretty well. We've broken a lot of important stories. We've had a variety of different points of view represented on this show and on the site itself. But I'm hoping we can do even more in the next year and beyond that for our readers and for our members. But if you want to become a member today, you want to be on the podcast and have your own member segment, head over to thereload.com and pick up a membership today. We'll bring on hopefully many more members in the future. I really enjoy getting to know you guys. And, that's it for this week's episode, but we'll see you guys again next week.